Thank you very much, Willow. And I wanted to start with a question before opening it to the audience. You've given different readings of Juliet through different critical thinkers, starting from through Nietzschean and the Kantian paradigm, through Adorno up until the contemporary. But I wonder if you could perhaps say something more about the encounter of Adorno, missed encounter perhaps, of Adorno with Lacan regarding Sade. And I'm here specifically referring to the essay Kant with Sade on the part of Lacan, so we could say Adorno with avec Lacan perhaps as a different interpretation. I was thinking, listening to you, that you made a very good point in terms of a very clear development of the way in which Adorno really emphasizes how Sade is showing through his writing the way in which the logical failure of the law, basically. And on the other hand, you take Lacan mainly through the question of female sexuality of the seminar of Ancora. But I was wondering if through the essay of Kant with Sade, what can we say about Lacan's idea that Sade in fact brings somehow the idea of the law to its final completion and success, in the sense that he represents a sort of a pure desire which has to give a room to a kind of to jouissance itself and encounter with the real, and it is through the encounter with the real that you have this production of a kernel of singularity, which is not individuality in a Lacanian framework, on the contrary, but which dismantles the real bourgeois subject. So a very different approach, counter, so to say, to Adorno, but at the same time there are moments in which perhaps they can touch each other. I wonder if you had any reflection about that, how that could fit your reflections.
Yeah, thank you for that question and comment. I have a feeling you actually know more about this than I do, because I kind of enter dialectic of enlightenment as a Nietzsche scholar. So I come at it through that, and through looking at specifically what Adorno and Horkheimer have to say about Nietzsche and Sade. And the part near the end where I get into talking about, for example, Lacan and Butler and Ahmed, I don't think there is a continuity there between their different analyses. But this is kind of a work in progress, so it's about exploring the different ways in which Juliet is understood. But I think reading Juliet through this notion of sovereignty is a kind of different practice than reading her through the framework of desire or jouissance, right? When, you know, Juliet, as would be in Lacanian terms, the monstrous, right? Is someone who can't move down the symbolic order, someone who's got stuck in one position because their eye is locked on obtaining something, which is to be the law itself, right? Not to find their place within the law, but to become the law, right? So that's definitely a different movement that she takes. And I think what's interesting about reading her through the lens of Nietzsche is this conflict between trying to be what the law provides for, and then when one can't find themselves a place within it, what are the consequences of that? One tries to recreate or become the law and loses a sense of the dialectical struggle, right? And I think that's also what Adorno and Horkheimer are talking about, is the problem with there being a resolution. And that's precisely what happens when Juliet becomes a law. There is no movement, there is no dialectic anymore, there is just a law, and she has become it, right? And that is truly the monstrous. So I think, yeah, that's how I would see it.
Thanks. And Clint?
Yeah, thanks, Willow. I don't remember if you, just now you were talking about eyes locked on Juliet, or eyes locked on her goal, and I don't remember if you used that phrase when you were going through the when you have the quote from Nietzsche towards the beginning, and he talked about perspectivalism, and then moving out of the sort of like dehistoricized subject. And it made me think of, Pascal talks about at one point how with a painting, there's a certain point in which you have to be not too close, not too far to have the proper perspective on the painting, but that's not true for morality, for matters of morality. And so there's that on the one hand, and then when you were talking about the Lacan and his seminar on feminine sexuality, and feminine jouissance, or the feminine subject, has two desires at once: the desire for the phallus, but also the desire for another pleasure, the other sort of jouissance. And so that's a splitting. So that's kind of a split. I think for Lacan, that's why the feminine subject is the ideal subject. It's a split subject in a certain kind of way. It's not trying to reconcile that split. So what I'm trying to, where I'm going with this question, what I'm trying to think of, because you have this, we have Adorno, avec Sade, or Adorno, avec Nietzsche. We have the splitting of these different kinds of Germanic sort of traditions. And then you're trying to, I think this is a term that Samir said Sherry's going to be talking about tonight, trying to perhaps reconcile them in a certain kind of way. But how do what's the perspective we have on this morality? Is the question I'm asking here. Okay, so like, what's the standpoint that we have today in the so-called post-theory, as well as post-truth sort of moment, on a morality that on the one hand, as you're saying Kant, or as you're saying Nietzsche and Sade, as these dark figures of the Enlightenment, are attempting to show the limits of the Kantian sort of subject. But where is our perspective today on this? I don't know if it's too general a question, but that's go.
Yeah, where is our perspective on this today? I mean, it really depends on who you talk to. A lot of people are very passionate about defending the notion of the universal human and saying, like, almost in a Fanonian line, like in Black Skin, White Mass, that what matters first is being human and nothing else is relevant, right? And then there's other people who are still interested in the politics of difference and trying to understand other ways for understanding the human subject, because the Kantian model is neutralized of affect and is something that's based on a Eurocentric, androcentric notion. So there are other philosophers, I think, mainly feminist philosophers, who are making interesting interventions into that, and I think it comes out of the notion of mimesis, as mimesis as human beings being mimetic subjects. And you can see that in Butler's work on performance, and somewhat in Ahmed's notion of willfulness as more of a political subject that's engaged in mimesis as a way towards liberation. But I think the most interesting account that I've read is actually from the Italian feminist Adriana Cavarero, who talks about inclination, and she writes specifically against the Kantian subject for being an autonomous, resolute, kind of alone individual who's not inclined towards other human beings. So she tries to recreate a new notion of the universal human that is connected to Arendt's notion of natality, what connects us to each other, that we're all born. And she says that we are all born from a woman's body, and we have that experience, and our primary experiences as being human is through being cared for and being inclined to care for other people. So it's about trying to rethink what the human subject is through different narratives, through different philosophical accounts, and I think Juliet is a very difficult one, and she does work to destabilize it. And I think what she shows to us is like the kind of radical ends that the characteristics that are most celebrated in the Kantian subject, which is reason, autonomy, perseverance, overcoming of immaturity, being enterprising, and all these kinds of things he talks about in What is Enlightenment, where that can go if there aren't other kinds or notions of the human subject to provide, in a sense, a counterforce or another idea of dealing with the human subject. So, I mean, I think we're at a bit of a crossroads with that one, and I think it's time to decapitate the Kantian subject myself. He needs, and that's a little bit what Juliet is doing, I believe, and that's why I'm interested in her. Yeah.
Samir.
Yeah.
Thank you for that terrific paper. Very rich at so many levels. I'd like to just ask a question about perspectivism. We can understand it in space spatial terms in the way that Nietzsche lays out in that quote. The multiplication of eyes and the enrichment and enhancement of our view of objectivity. But we can also understand perspectivism in temporal terms as well,
Right.
historical terms,
Right.
which is why Gadamer talks about the fusion of horizons. Right? We need to be mindful of the tendency to project the present into the past, but also of the illusion of trying to understand the past better than it understood itself. And I think we're confronted with the need to be mindful of our own perspectivism in two distinct senses, I think, in relation to your talk. And one has to do with universalism. We can continue to progress with this, or continue with the project of capitating the Kantian subject, but we also have to realize that it puts us into very close proximity with precisely those very dark forces that want to do exactly the same, right? The alt-right today, and more generally, the neo-fascists who are arising all over the place, want nothing better than to undermine the Enlightenment, its legacy. They'd like to reverse the French Revolution, and so on. It's a kind of neo-romanticism, which is why you get, somebody like Nick Land really celebrating a kind of dark Enlightenment. The dark thinkers of the Enlightenment gives you the dark Enlightenment. Nick Land. And I think, is it the right moment to make that kind of a criticism of universalism? As Atu Seishiotu says, he's a phenomenal scholar, universalism is too important to concede to Europe. And the second is, I think that there are some really interesting implications that follow from Angela Carter's reading of Sade. And what she's arguing is that this completely demolishes our understanding of gender in general and femininity in particular. That today is a dangerous kind of argument to make, right? Again, perspectivism. Things have changed to the point where, thinkers like that become, in a sense, very problematic because of the way they treat the category of gender. So these are extremely, difficult questions. And I don't know if there's, actually, I don't know if there's a particular question. It's more like a comment. If you have any reflections on that.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely sympathetic to what you're saying, and I know for you, the Kantian universal subject is very important to return to, and I also return to that, but I think it needs to be, we need to take its shadow and reform it, and so it's not about Kant, right? So it's like, and that's what I think Adriana Cavarel works on. I think Hannah Arendt does that in her own way, and so I think that there's other thinkers that we need to turn to philosophically, and maybe at the political level, at the level of everyday discourse, we still need to call to universalism. Certainly this is the foundation of, our law also, is the belief in dignity and things like that come out of Kant, and a particular tradition of enlightenment, and going back to Plato, etc., right? But I just think it's not a reason to stop thinking about how it can be broadened or how it can be reformed, how it does need to be rethought. We shouldn't hang on to something that's imperfect because it's being used, those who criticize it are being used by the wrong political forces. Like, I don't think that's a reason philosophically to stop talking about something simply because people on the other side are using the critique that you still think is useful philosophically for nefarious political ends. So, yeah, it does, but it doesn't mean like, okay, well, now someone has used, like, Nietzsche, for example. People from the alt-right have used Nietzsche. The fascists use Nietzsche. The Nazis use Nietzsche, right? Feminists have also used Nietzsche. Emma Goldman used Nietzsche. A lot of very important, the Black Panthers read Nietzsche. Fanon read Nietzsche. So do we stop using a thinker or stop writing about that thinker and that amazing impact that they've had historically because someone on the wrong side of politics is now using them? I mean, that to me also seems problematic. So to take the focus away from something like the universal subject, which is still an androcentric white supremacist model that is still used to limit the notion of what is a human, to stop criticizing that because people on the wrong side are doing that, to me seems like not the right choice.
I think
You know,
that's
it's,
probably where our disagreement is.
yeah, so, yeah.
Yes, Glenn.
Thanks, Willow.
Yeah.
I'm in agreement with everything you said, basically. I'm a college instructor, and I teach a lot of international and domestic students. So in the context of that, in the recent federal election, whose results are consistently disappointing for me. I'm an immigrant from India and Canadian citizen, and so just the notion of citizenship and the way that it depends on this idea of the subject, right? And I want to ask a kind of question about pedagogy and what our intention as educators should be if it's not enlightenment. In other words, you know, if we encourage, let's imagine a situation where everybody was reading Foucault and Nietzsche and Horkheimer and Adorno critically and dialectically, you know, would that be a way of moving thought further to the left? To just put it in the most kind of crude terms. Do you know what I mean? Like, what should be the attitude of educators given the extent of this critique of enlightenment?
I mean, my specific pedagogical practices is to include more feminist thinkers, to include more post-colonial thinkers, to include, you know, to stay with the canon because people want to learn the canon, they do. Like what I've noticed is when you take too many people off the canon, the students come back to you and they ask for it. And I teach a lot of survey classes and students come to me and they say, we just want a class on the great books. Like, can we just read the Critique of Pure Reason, or can we just read like the Genealogy of Morals and have one class on that? Because they want to know what feminist thinkers and post-colonial thinkers in the continental tradition are critiquing. So in a sense, I think you need both. And of course, like the practice of thinking critically, I'm, you know, critiquing the rationalization of enlightenment or the instrumentalization of rationality is not the same thing as rejecting critical thinking. So that's not what I was trying to argue for. And that's certainly not what I think educators should do. We have to teach, that's very foundational at the beginning, to teach critical thinking, which is about reason. But it's also about perspectival reason. And from the time that I started out in philosophy, because all my degrees are in philosophy, there was a significant shift for me as an educator now in terms of the number of non-white thinkers and non-male thinkers that are in the curriculum. And I think it's an important and tremendous transformation. And I see that with students, how students respond to those texts, how students respond to me as a female teacher in philosophy, how the female students respond. So having more different kinds of people as teachers, you know, representation, that's the old liberal argument, but there's something to it. And having more texts that aren't just European white thinkers, I think it does help. But that doesn't mean that you walk away from critical thinking. Of course, that's extremely important, and that should be first what is taught, right? How to think critically. But once you do that, then you can start thinking about the nuances of it and how sometimes it leaves out certain voices, or it can be used in a certain way for purposes that are immoral or apolitical or whatever, right?
Yeah, again, I agree with you there, but what I'm asking is sort of like the theoretical underpinning or the intention is that there can be a process of enlightenment, right? So that there's a kind of, I wouldn't call it false consciousness, I think that's too strong, but some idea that despite the entrenched patriarchy and capitalism, that there is an educability of the subject.
Oh, definitely. And, you know, even in this paper, which is, you know, I'm not putting my own personal beliefs behind this paper, you know, it's a scholarly paper. So it's something different, isn't it, than one's own personal political beliefs. But, you know, it's Nietzsche, Horkheim and Adorno, they're not rejecting Kant wholeheartedly. They're being critical of him. That's what I see, right? And whenever you engage in critique with someone, you're showing a great respect for them and showing that they have relevance, ongoing relevance. So in fact, critique is a type of work of admiration. At least that's how I see it. So of course, yeah, even when you read, so I'm teaching Intro to Continental Philosophy, and the first thing I teach is what is enlightenment. And I don't attack that text. We talk about it. We think with Kant. We think about it. It's a very inspiring and important text. Learning to think for yourself, beyond authority. You know, this is important. This is foundational, definitely.
Any other question to conclude this session? No? Then thank you. No, yes. There is one,
Yeah.
Andre.
Yeah.
Just a very brief
Okay.
comment, and it has to do with subversion of the name of from a Kantian perspective.
Yeah.
Another way of looking at it is espousing the perversion of the longer, and a regression to call it a jouissance that can propagate itself. The purpose of the subversion is to have a jouissance all to yourself,
Right.
which I suppose is a way of looking at what Juliet was doing.
Yeah.
It's a regression to a disavowal of the thought, not a foreclosure, but disavowal of the thought, and moving away, conscious moving away from authority.
Yeah, I mean, I also see for her as it being, like Sarah Ahmed said, willful work, because she's trying to survive, right? So it's also related to her need to survive and find jouissance in her need to survive, right? And I think that's part of what's interesting about her as a figure, is that she kind of sees, okay, this is the position that I find myself in as a subject within a world in which we are trained to be sovereign individuals, and this is the only way into becoming sovereign I can find, so I better enjoy it, right? But she's flagellating herself when she says that, you know?
Second, not first.
Yeah, that's how I see
There's
it.
a little difference.
Yeah, I see it differently. Okay. Thank you.